The Gold Coast is perhaps Australia's strangest and most fascinating city of the last few decades. Originally a tourist getaway spot for the people of Brisbane, right in the bottom corner of southeast Queensland, the Gold Coast ballooned into a national and even international tourist destination throughout the 1980s and hasn't really stopped its incredible development ever since. As the economy of this tourist city has blossomed, so too has its infrastructure, in an attempt to keep the city highly accessible not only to the many tourists who pour through the city every year, but also for the ever-increasing population needed to maintain the bustling economy. Allow me, if you will, to tell a personal story I experienced earlier this year. I take my family from our home in southern Sydney up to the Gold Coast almost every year to visit family who live up there and to see all the usual tourist destinations. This normally means booking return flights direct from Sydney Domestic Airport to Gold Coast Coolangatta Airport. However, this year, things went wrong. Our flight was cancelled from Sydney Airport mere hours before it was scheduled to leave, and less than an hour before we planned to leave our house. Desperately, we looked to see if we could book a replacement flight, but there was no more options left headed for Coolangatta. The next closest airport was Brisbane Domestic Airport. We booked the Brisbane flight, and my mother-in-law drove over an hour and a half in peak hour traffic from Surfers Paradise to Brisbane Airport. There was still one problem though. The car couldn't fit everyone in, not without leaving our bags behind at least, so someone would have to find their own way. It wasn't going to be my mother-in-law who made the drive to come get us, it wasn't going to be my kids, and I didn't want my wife travelling alone in a city she wasn't familiar with in Brisbane, so I decided that I was going to take some bags and find my own way from Brisbane to the Gold Coast. My wife suggested I book an Uber, but me being me, I decided to check the trains. And this, dear viewers, is where we reach the silver lining of this story and the point of the video. The Southeast Queensland Rail Network, though not perfect, as any public transportation network is an incredible achievement in public infrastructure, connecting the people of Southeast Queensland to the central hub of the state in the city of Brisbane, and came an absolute clutch in my time of need. Sitting in my lounge room in Sydney, waiting for my new flight to Brisbane, I was able to pull up the map on the SEQ rail network, plan my trip from Brisbane Airport to my desired stop on the Gold Coast, and pay for my ticket all in the time it took my wife to explain the plan to her mum. That night, I saw my family off in my mother-in-law's car from Brisbane Airport, walked up the causeway to the air train, and followed the Beenleigh and Gold Coast lines through the CBD of Brisbane, and then down to Helensvale in the northwest of the Gold Coast, where I got off and transferred onto the G-Link, the Gold Coast light rail system that runs to the coast through Parkwood and Southport before turning south right through the heart of the city, from Main Beach down to Surfers Paradise and Broad Beach. This tourist-minded rail link keeps Australia's holiday destination connected with its state capital as they had been for decades prior to the Gold Coast boom of the 80s, and demonstrates the need for a reliable transport contingency to help people when failures occur. The Gold Coast local government seems to know how vital this rail network is, and especially the G-Link, to their city. The Gold Coast is so tourist-oriented that it simply must provide these transportation solutions to its visitors in order to maintain its primary industry and ensure that people can travel around to engage in said tourism. But there is another, more treacherous side of the Gold Coast transportation network, and it is the one the locals live with every day: the roads. As the Gold Coast continues to balloon in population as Australia's largest non-capital city, more and more foresight is put into the infrastructure construction of the city, but in very specific ways. In my most recent visit to Goldie, my mother-in-law let us borrow her car to visit the theme parks up in Oxenford, as to get there by train meant travelling almost the entire G-Link to Helensvale, and then a bus from there to the parks. This was certainly doable, and I have done it before with my kids, but we had limited time on this trip, so I caved on my love of trains and took the car, which is significantly faster, thanks to no small part to the slow nature of the light rail system. What I witnessed as a result was mind-boggling. The Gold Coast, with close to 750,000 people living in it, already has massive superhighways dividing its sprawling suburbs, putting larger cities like Melbourne and Sydney to shame, and in certain points, the roads are more comparable to LA than any Australian city. Despite having a population size only a fraction that of Sydney or Melbourne, and highways wider than anything those cities could ever hope of building in their already crowded suburbia, the Gold Coast is already experiencing concerning levels of road congestion, as people travelling from the suburbs into the city for their jobs flock to the only viable option built for them. The G-Link serves the CBD and tourist hotspots well, and the Gold Coast line connects the mid-western suburbs running just behind the iconic beach strip with the Beenleigh line back up to Brisbane with reasonable success. But the vast majority of people living on the Gold Coast have no reasonable public transportation options, which is strange given how well the city accommodates those needs for its guests. It is obvious that this divide is a result of the clear economic incentive the city sees behind accommodating its tourists, but this philosophy is never applied to the locals when it really should be. A populace that has a stronger public transportation network would be more inclined to travel around the city for leisure, have more money to spend throughout the economy rather than on car and road maintenance, and would be spared hours of unproductive work sitting in traffic every week. As the Gold Coast attempts to stay ahead of its own growth, this system of highways is working for the moment, but it is destined to fail. More roads, and larger roads, may fix traffic congestion in the short term, but they inevitably fail in the long term due to induced demand. Simply put, if all you build is roads, people are forced to use those roads, and they crowd up faster than you can ever expand them. Thanks to the inherent inefficiencies of cars and their inability to operate in the effective economies of scale necessary for city transportation, there will never be as effective a transport solution as a train. If the Gold Coast Council and Queensland State Government invested as much money into expanding the rail and light rail services as they do into building these massive roads to preempt the traffic they correctly assess will come in this strange, self-fulfilling prophecy, they would have a far more efficient solution to their problem on a basic human level, and of course go much further to protecting the environment, not only in regards to short-term carbonisation levels, but long-term impacts on the environmental habitat. What the Gold Coast needs is a smaller scale duplicate of what the SEQ network provides for Brisbane already. And hell, while we're at it, increase the frequency of the air train so that people can travel by air to Brisbane and then by train to the Gold Coast like I did, eliminating the need for direct flights to the Gold Coast, which would be a massive boost in decarbonisation efforts. The obvious argument against that idea is how much longer it takes to make that trip, but maybe that's why we need high-speed rail, a topic for another instalment in this series.